years. In recent days, Mexico has been thrown into turmoil. The killing of one of the country's most powerful cartel leaders has ignited a wave of chaos that is spreading across multiple states. Streets once filled with everyday life have become battlegrounds as cartel factions retaliate with roadblocks, arson attacks, and armed confrontations against security forces. This eruption of violence follows the death of the head of a major drug cartel, a figure long considered untouchable. His influence stretched across Mexico and deep into international trafficking networks. For years, he evaded capture, protected by layers of loyal gunmen, corrupt officials, and a vast criminal empire. But the operation that ended his life didn't happen in isolation. Behind the scenes, the United States played a significant role. For years, U.S. agencies had been tracking his movements, linking his organization to large-scale drug trafficking, especially fentanyl, flowing across the border. Intelligence sharing between the U.S. and Mexico intensified, and diplomatic pressure mounted. Washington had placed a multi-million-dollar bounty on his head, making him one of the most sought-after cartel figures in the world. That pressure helped set the stage for the final operation. Mexican forces moved in, acting on intelligence that had been pieced together through joint investigations. The raid was swift, and the cartel leader was fatally wounded. His death marked a major victory for both governments, but it also unleashed the fury of his organization.
Spontaneous, it was not. An organized, strategic arson operation across at least 15 Mexican states. Lorries, cars, shops, businesses. The government's special forces operation, which killed the boss of Mexico's most violent drugs cartel, answered with what that cartel does best. More violence. Gun battles in deserted streets. This was Zacapu in Michoacan state. The drug gang calling the government's bluff. Whack us and we'll hit back. 25 National Guard officers killed across the country, but President Claudia Sheinbaum's having none of that, claiming her government's in control.
The most important thing at this moment is to guarantee peace and safety of all the population of all of Mexico, and that is being done. Today there's more tranquility, there's government armed forces, security cabinet, and there's a lot of coordination.
Fuerzas Armadas.
She may be right. Early today, little sign of the recent violence continuing, but for so many Mexicans, terrorized for so long by gangs apparently beyond the control of the state, confidence in security is a long, long way off.
Well, the truth is, the whole situation that's happening is very serious. Unfortunately, it's not the first time we're experiencing this. Fear is everywhere on the streets.
Honestly, I'm coming to school with worry. I'm coming with some fear and apprehension. We don't know what kind of impact it will have.
It's gone on for decades. People hanged from bridges as a lesson to others not to cross the gangs. 130,000 people and more have disappeared. The government said it was helped by US intelligence moving against El Mencho or Nemesio Oseguara Cervantes, longtime head of the Jalisco New Generation cartel. Subject of a $15 million reward from the US government, responsible, they say, for trafficking cocaine, fentanyl and other drugs across the border. Authorities say he was injured in the raid and died en route to Mexico City.
It's very likely that we're now going to see fighting between potential successors of El Mencho. This is just one leader and a very important leader, and of course the killing has been very symbolic and a strong political statement. But of course the structure or the organization as such is still intact.
Smoke-shrouded Puerto Vallarta on the Pacific coast. Tourist honeypot. Once upon a time, Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor fell in love here. Things a bit different in recent days. This was El Mencho's home turf. Chaos at Guadalajara Airport. Passengers scrambling upstairs in fear. In a little over 3 months, this place will welcome Football World Cup fans. Months in which the massive drugs gang will now have to find a new leader. A process unlikely to involve CVs and focus groups, but fear and extreme violence.
Well, joining me now from Mexico City is the journalist Joan Grillo, who focuses on drugs and organised crime in Latin America and wrote the El Narco trilogy of books. Thank you for joining us. It's an extraordinary expression of the power of the cartels. What does it tell us about who holds power in Mexico?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this tactic, which has a term for it called the narco blockade. And we first started hearing this term about 20 years ago in the 2000s. They started using these things, a tactic copied from political protesters, hijacking vehicles, burning them to block roads. And it got bigger and bigger till you saw in 2019 shutting down a whole city in Culiacan, Sinaloa. And then we've seen this on a new scale. They talk about 252 different incidents across the country. You know, schools shut down, really the whole country shut down, and people in shock. One thing that was really remarkable this morning in the press conference, when you had the defense secretary talk about the death of the soldiers and 25 soldiers killed, is an enormous loss for the Mexican military. Imagine that on a single day. And he was holding back tears. I think that really reflects the shock. So a question of holding power or using violence to threaten the state. And one academic called Ben Lessing has a term, he calls it violent lobbying. You use violence to try and get the government, to lobby the government to back off.
How much pressure has the Mexican government been under from the Americans, particularly ahead of the World Cup, to crack down?
Immense pressure. Since as soon as Trump got in, even before Trump took power, once he won the election, he was threatening Mexico on this issue. He was saying, unless Mexico cleans its house and fights cartels and stops fentanyl coming to the United States and killing Americans and stops migrants coming and flooding our southern border, we're going to impose 25% tariffs. Or we're going to go in with our military and do unilateral US military attacks on these cartels. So this is immense pressure. Now, Mexico is the #1 trading partner with the United States, above China and above Canada, approaching $870 billion in cross-border trade with the United States. So Mexico really values this relationship and has been complying and trying to, please the United States, been handing over major cartel figures in extraordinary transfers, not involving extradition processes. And now this attack, and it's the Mexican soldiers taking the brunt of the violence and the deaths on the street here.
But at the same time, they're trying to say to the outside world, come to Mexico and come for the football. Are foreigners still relatively safe?
The question of the World Cup, and one of the sources was telling me that the part of the US pressure was saying, you've got to take this guy Mencho down before the World Cup, kind of using that as a form of pressure, saying, because there's going to be games in Jalisco state itself. So you've got to take that gangster out before we have a joint World Cup. However, actually, by taking him out, you make the world see the violence, and people who've got tickets for the World Cup will be scared. Being someone myself, I do cover this violence, personally, but I do think this violence comes and goes, and I still think people can come, and there's 7,000 troops now in Jalisco, and most people will be able to enjoy these World Cup games, but it definitely is not a good advertisement for Mexico having these kind of blockades across the country and shootouts that you're seeing on TV.
Joan Grillo, thank you very much.
Now, Mexico is facing the aftermath. Cities are on high alert. Military convoys patrol the streets. Civilians are urged to stay indoors as cartel gunmen lash out in a show of force meant to prove they are still powerful, even without their leader. The question now is, what comes next? Will this blow weaken the cartel? Or will a new wave of violence emerge as rivals fight for control? And how deeply will the United States continue to be involved in the battles unfolding just across its border? This story is far from over, and the consequences could reshape the balance of power in Mexico's criminal underworld for years to come.
The U.S. State Department is telling Americans in Mexico to shelter in place as law enforcement tries to regain control of cities that have fallen into chaos in the hands of the Mexican cartels. This is after the Mexican military took out a notorious cartel kingpin with U.S. support. And we're learning a little bit more about our role in all of that. Not a lot of detail, but we had one. The carnage, cars torched, roads blocked, banks and local businesses set on fire as those cartels are now fighting for power. It's like everybody else is in the middle of a gang war right now. Wanted drug lord known as El Mencho was killed in a U.S.-backed military raid. He founded a vast criminal network which has the highest cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine trafficking capacity in Mexico. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt applauded the move, and here's what she wrote. El Mencho was a top target for the Mexican and U.S. government as one of the top traffickers of fentanyl. President Trump has been very clear the U.S. will ensure narco-terrorists sending deadly drugs to our homeland are forced to face the wrath of justice they have long deserved. Former Pinal County Sheriff Mark Lamb joined me last hour on the Faulkner Focus.
This is exactly what they're doing in Puerto Vallarta. What they are doing is burning buses, lighting gas stations on fire because they want to create terror for those who struck a nerve. This will create compression amongst those other cartels. We may see more violence stem from this, but what we're seeing right now is their capability for violence, and this should awake Americans up. This is why it's so important to close our borders.
The borders are essentially closed, and the drugs flowing across, Griff, have dwindled to nearly zero, thank goodness. Not quite there, but certainly the human trafficking. What is there for people on the left to catch on to at this point?
So this is a big deal, Harris, and it couldn't be a more dangerous time to be in Mexico because of what Sheriff Lamb was talking about. So a power vacuum was now created. El Mencho was the top trafficker of cocaine, methamphetamine, fentanyl coming across in the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. Now, remember, last summer, El Mayo, who was the leader of the Sinaloa Cartel, was taken. The U.S. captured him. It led to a spike in 400% increase in homicides in Mexico. Now we're going to see it even more so because Jalisco New Generation is the dominant cartel. And they're going to start retaliating now against Mexican officials because of this. And don't forget, for 4 years under the Biden administration, they lined their pockets with money. That's why you see these stunning videos of the cartel leaders in armored vehicles that rival U.S. military firepower. They're going to retaliate against the officials, but then they're going to fight the rival factions that are trying to fill El Mencho. And so it's really a lot of unanswered questions of really where and how they're going to retaliate against Mexican officials, and then the war that's going to go on with the cartel, which puts Americans stuck in Mexico at a very, very high risk.
Yeah, the list last night, Tommy, that some of us put out on social media of all the areas that were basically in lockdown, shelter in place, was pretty long. It wasn't just Jalisco and Puerto Vallarta and some of the other areas where we know Americans go, but it was a lot of different states within that country.
I think Americans need to understand something that doesn't feel comfortable, but anytime you as an American travel to Mexico, there is a limited amount of things that the American government can do for you there. Yes, they've put out the warnings, they said shelter in place, they can help you a little bit with the embassy, but when you decide to travel to Mexico, a lot of people think you go to a resort, you're going to be safe, nothing happens there. Well, I think they're finding out the hard way that that's not necessarily true. In 2017, a friend of mine from California was stabbed to death in Playa del Carmen. And that was just walking from bar to bar in a resort area. So I've been sounding the alarm on this for almost 10 years now, saying, if you're an American going to Mexico, have a great time, but understand the risks. And to the point about President Trump and his message, we saw it in the first administration, his message to Mexico was the threat of tariffs if the Mexican military doesn't do their part to secure the border. And then the Mexican military stepped up. Now we flash forward to administration 2.0. President Trump says, I'm not going to tolerate not only the human trafficking, but the drug trafficking. And now the Mexican military, once again, stepping up to do their part to secure their own country. That, in my opinion, is a direct response to President Trump and how tough he's been on this issue.
Talk to me about tariffs, because you knew we'd get there eventually, and Tommy got us there. You've got a new round coming, potentially, that the president and his staff have worked on to get beyond what the U.S. Supreme Court did. It sounds like, from what Tommy's saying, you may need those more immediately, particularly given the situation that's going on
a national security basis, which is the reason that he implemented those tariffs in the first place. Liberation Day, April of 2025. Fast forward to now. The steel and aluminum tariffs, by the way, are still in place. That's a separate issue than what the Supreme Court ruled on, and that is a big piece of it.
Those are sectoral.
Yes, like and Canada, that's why you've seen more and more auto manufacturing that is coming back into the United States. Again, is this a safety concern? Because before the parts were going back, they were going from Canada to the U.S. down to Mexico and then back. Sometimes these components were going back and forth to Mexico. A lot of that is ending, and a lot of the automakers had expressed concerns for the safety of their employees in Mexico. The U.S. government has not only do you have this designation of a terrorist organization with Jalisco, but you also have them giving us a price tag on the cartel industry as it exists right now in Mexico. It is a multi-billion-dollar industry on an annual basis because they're not just into fentanyl and into meth and cocaine and human trafficking. They're also, they steal oil from Pemex and then they sell it. They have extortion operations around the country, the different groups of the cartel do, where they extort the avocado farmers. They extort small businesses, nightclubs. It is an unbelievable. So even though the border has been effectively shut down, even though the fentanyl, to your point, production has really slowed down, in particular in the southern part, like in the Sonoran region, we've seen that. Still, this is not exactly a moment in time where the cartels are going to say, oh, we're just going to walk away from the billions of dollars. And by the way, they have crypto trading operations as well. It is so much more than what Americans, I think, understand.
Yeah, Emily, as we look at these pictures from there and all the videos over the weekend, it's terrifying.
It is. Thank you for pointing out to the vast enterprise network that the cartels have been engaging in for decades. They are loath to and will not surrender $1 of that multi-billion-dollar illicit revenue that they've been getting for years at all. And they've been exploiting the northern border through our northern neighbors who don't have the same drug trafficking and human trafficking and illicit types of data, statistics, and tracking that we do here in the States. The green gold of the avocado farms, the oil seizures, those cartels have that entire country and its economics and ecosystem under a tight fist. And I'm worried that the news cycle covers this as Americans are in the danger that they are, but that it will go back to the thin veneer of safety that we've been enjoying as tourists for decades. We know that power vacuums beget violence and exploitation, and that's what's been happening this entire time. That's why there are those multiple factions, because back in the day, it used to just be one. Now Jalisco's on top, right? It didn't used to be like that, but this is what shifts. The last Mexican elections were the bloodiest of all time, and the amount of journalists that have been murdered, the amount of influencers on live streaming, the amount of targeted what's the word I'm looking for? When the cartels are recruiting young people there, it starts at a very young age. They hold their families hostage. They have now music and pop culture influences for these kids. It is a reign of terror. And to think, by the way, that the government is somehow distinct from the cartels is a very naive and foolish way of thinking. They are deeply embedded, and I'm not quite sure what our next steps are diplomatically, but it requires a very complex and nuanced approach to this country and to those cartels. I think that takes years of investments. This is not just a current administration diplomatic solution.
It's such a great point. I was just playing for Emily in the green room before he came out the narco ballad for Mencho. It's called Soy Mencho. It's like a popular song. They start young and influence it. I would just add to, we don't know what's going to happen next. I think one thing that may help tamp the violence down is that President Sheinbaum has a lot of pressure to get this under control before the FIFA World Cup. Because the Mexican people love soccer. And if this continues, there will be questions about whether you can hold those World Cup matches down there. And so she's got a tight timeline.
Yeah. On my very short walk from one set to the other, to this one, a few minutes ago, we learned that there were 25 members of the Mexican army that responded and took out El Mencho, and that's a high number if you consider that they're going in to get somebody and they take that kind of damage and harm to themselves. So Sheinbaum, I just have a question. They knew that we were going to help them. They knew what the plan was, and still, you've got a situation that is very explosive right now. Can she handle what's going on now across a lot of the country?
Well, in 25 guard members that were announced, it was made by Mexico's Secretary of Security. His name is Omar Garcia Harfuch. El Mencho tried to kill him in 2020, failed. He's now the top Homeland Security person, if you will. So there's a lot of motivation to revenge those 25 guard members that were killed.
May I say, just a plug, if you're interested in this, you want to learn more than we have in this time here, listen to the podcast Borderland with Katarina Schultz. She has been on the ground there covering this for years. I trust her her explicitly, and she frankly has been digging up all of those horrific details that make us uncomfortable, but that are so necessary for us to know.
For what we call the truth.
Mm-hmm.